Hello and welcome to another episode of Leaders of Transformation. We are in a series on how to start a movement, and we have a wonderful guest here that I actually reached out to specifically. And he's a busy man. He's traveling. He's currently in Australia, but specifically, I wanted to have him on talking about how number one, he's a movement maker, a game changer himself, but he's also been studying game changers over the last number of years in business and has some wonderful insights to share about his experience. And so I'm just really, really excited to have him here and grateful that he took the time out to be here today. So Andrew Hewitt has been uniting the game changers of our time to evolve economics and address the systemic challenges that we face. His frameworks are famous for simplifying complexity while reinforcing that transformational change begins with a change in self. He is the founder of the Game Changers 500, which is a ranking of the world's top mission-driven businesses. So Andrew, welcome to Leaders of Transformation. We're excited that you're here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's talk about this, game changers. How do you define a game changer? Let's maybe start there as a framework for people to see little bit of your mindset. Yeah.
Well, there's all sorts of buzzwords, right? Whether it's change makers or game changers or whatever we want to frame it as, social entrepreneurs, etc. I very deliberately use the word game, as there is change you can make within an existing system, an existing game. But when you change the game, that's when the larger behavior change happens. Because games have these common elements. They have an objective, they have a point system, there's a training mechanism for the game, how you train for it, how you reward. And so game changing to me is a higher level of change. And it's actually what leads to sustained behavior change in time. And so where I've arrived at my journey in terms of how do we address this collision of crises that we face is that we need vast behavior change. And so we need to go beyond the incremental change and move towards a game change. So I define a game changer as somebody who is committed to that level of change, who's committed to the broader system level change, and recognizes that often the problems that we're trying to solve are really just symptoms of a larger problem.
Yes. And I love the analogy of a game. And when you were talking there, it actually reminded me, I remember being in a training with one of my mentors who's a big fan of using game analogies and realizing that, there are players in a game, there are rules to a game, there's a framework, a boundary lines, there's how do you score and all these different things. And I love what you said there about it's actually changing the game itself rather than, and I was talking to somebody else recently about this, where I was a guest on her show, and we were talking about the change. A lot of times what happens, I notice that people they're repackaging the same thing, and they're like, oh, it's a whole new thing, but it's actually the same. It's an old thing with a new packaging on it, and that doesn't create true transformation. And I hear that's what you're talking about here. So you gathered these game changers, identified who they were, and then ranked them, on this ranking system. So in the process of that, what were some of the things that you looked for in terms of criteria? How did you identify, what constitutes someone who's at ranking number 1 versus somebody who's at ranking number 500? What's the difference?
Sure. So first, to clarify, the ranking was a ranking of companies, although it was a process of finding the leaders behind those companies, who are the people I call game changers. So I really refer to the word game changers as a person, but these businesses you could term as for benefit, mission driven, pick your favorite buzzword. But there was a very clear threshold that we were looking at that made this different from other kind of great places to work lists. And that was organizations that prioritized a purpose or a noble mission, so that it was clear that the organization gave priority to that mission over just making money. And so we look beyond legal structure. Often we fall in this middle space between a for-profit and a nonprofit. And these businesses are, whether they're structured as a for-profit or a nonprofit, the things they have in common is that they're generating revenue. So they have business activity, but they're giving priority to a mission. So an organization like Waikiki, whose mission is to steward over 100,000 acres of forest in South America, and they came up with the idea that growing yerba mate in the shade of these forests would allow these forests to survive, because they'd be more economically viable to keep than to cut down. And then they sell that yerba mate to people in, America and around the world who drink it as an alternative to tea or coffee. And it's a phenomenal example of a mission-driven organization, phenomenal ethics across all their practices. But they're really giving priority to that specific purpose. That's why they exist, and they're absolutely clear on it. So that was really the dividing line. And then the big question comes, well, how do you know if they're giving priority to a mission? Like, what are those indicators of an organization that's really doing that? And so there's a whole bunch of different practices here. One learning from the nonprofit space is a practice called a theory of change. And that's a clear strategy that defines how your mission will be realized and measured, and the mix in products and services that you prioritize to create that impact. So it's a strategy, right? It's like, here's where we're trying to go, here's our strategy to get there, and here's our impact indicators. And so that's a common thing that we saw. Another thing we saw is having an impact report. So rather than just having the strategy, actually producing a yearly impact report, rather than just measuring quarterly earnings or revenue, being able to actually show the measurements in terms of your impact to the world. And so there's a couple examples. I mean, I could go on. Legal structure is another one. We saw a lot of innovation happening in the space. You probably heard of B Corps or the B Corp certification, or the benefit corporation structure. There's different ways you can use legal structures to ensure that purpose remains the priority. And so that's another indicator we looked at. And then beyond just looking at organizations that were prioritizing their mission and purpose, we looked at a whole bunch of other practices in terms of how they treated their employees, how they treated their customers, the community, the environment, all stakeholders. And it was certainly a journey that iterated many, many times to find a way to do this in the most effective way. And it's an ongoing journey. There's still a lot of learning.
So what got you into this?
What got me into this?
Like what inspired you to say, that's what I'm going to do?
Yeah, it was a few things. One was, frankly, just waking up to the collision of crises that were facing us. This was about 12 years ago, and it was clear that the environment was being devastated, that there was massive social injustice, that, coming out of university, I watched so many of my friends graduate, climb the ladder in different corporations, and really just feel miserable and depressed. And, these bright lights of talent who are told we are the leaders of tomorrow, just being, just being really, like, just feeling null and disenchanted by this profit at all costs corporate mentality. And I just felt like, wow, what a waste of talent. And they were powering some of the most destructive companies. And so that led me to a deep inquiry in terms of, like, what do we do? Like, really, what's an effective response to this? And that's when I started looking at game theory and the whole idea of, like, what actually changes behavior at large. And and then here we are. So um, it's
So,
been
so
quite the
yeah,
inquiry.
those companies, like you said, they're powering some of the most destructive companies and companies that are the opposite of what you're uh, looking to showcase through the Game Changers. Now, some of those companies, do you think that some of them they started off, and maybe you've seen this even with some of the companies that have started off on your ranking system, and maybe they've kind of slipped back? Do you think that sometimes like they just get when you get so big that they just kind of lose sight of their mission and their purpose for the sake of shareholder earnings and whatever else, right? That they start to get so caught up in the business aspect of it that they forget. Do you notice that? Or is it just that the companies
Yeah,
that start
so
off profit driven stay profit driven, and companies that are purpose driven tend to stay purpose driven?
it's a really good question, and it's actually why about 2 years ago I stopped doing the rankings. I felt like we accomplished our mission. At the time, 12 years ago, it wasn't very well known what this type of business was. Social enterprise, B Corps was just kind of starting. So it was a big part of our theory of change was how do we popularize this? How do we create an alternative to the Fortune 500 so every university on the planet knows that there's an alternative to just a nonprofit path? And that's really been accomplished. I was a small part to do with that, but it's really quite amazing now to see that in every major university around the world, they're teaching social entrepreneurship or they're teaching how to be a mission driven company, which I think is phenomenal. The other thing though that's happened in terms of like what does the movement need next is actually the exactly what you're speaking to here is what I noticed is a lot of the companies that we ranked as best for the world over time as they grew, they started to slide back to more profit first capitalism. And that frankly was really, really challenging and let me in a bit of a spin of like, gosh, like this isn't what I was expecting. I thought we had this figured out. And I'm still in that inquiry. But yeah, there's a lot of examples. I mean, one that's more common now is Whole Foods. Whole Foods was just a phenomenal example in its early days as it grew of doing all the right things, and as it got bigger and bigger, it started getting called out more and more, which isn't that uncommon. But then it was more or less forced sold to Amazon. And there's always a story behind the story, but it's I would say that was not the intended outcome. And we see this also with Tom's shoes. Tom's was such a early model of this whole movement, buy one, give one. They really pioneered that whole space and and got into the point of like, okay, how do we grow? They did all the right things in terms of interviewing different partners, and Bain Capital came in, took a majority share in the organization, and but the performance of the company has really plummeted since then. It's people say it's lost its ways, and so and if it's not that, it's the next healthy food company that sells to you know big packaged goods company, Nestle, Unilever, you name it, and then struggle to keep their culture and their purpose first. And so that is a big question that we're sitting with as a movement in terms of how do you actually um, sustain a change in the game. And that's where my latest research has left me.
Yeah. Well, I recently saw, I can't believe everything you read on Facebook, but there was a list of companies that they said, basically the list was here are the healthy companies, health food companies, supplement companies, so forth, that sold out. And it showed their name, and then it showed who they sold out to. And it was quite surprising, the list. And
Yeah.
and disappointing as well, because knowing that at some level that culture may get lost in their purpose, the initial purpose. So you're in this inquiry right now as to how to do that. What have you discovered? There must be some companies that haven't lost their way, if you will. What are you noticing about in your early stage? I know you're still in the process of this, but in your early stage of research, what are you noticing that if that's something that you're finding is that the ones that are staying on course, how they're actually able to do that?
So this is where game theory actually comes in particularly useful, is when we look at this through the lens of a game, we can see that there's um, I like to call it level one, which is like a win-lose model of capitalism. And within the game, there's an objective, there's how you make choices, there's how you develop the players, the people, there's how you motivate people, there's how you assess performance, and then there's how you distribute benefit. So these are 6 game aspects that together create a whole system, a whole game. And so at level one, at kind of a win-lose model of the game, there's an objective that's, profit first. There's choice making, that's command and control leadership. There's development of people is really focused on training people for roles and results. Motivation is based on incentives to maximize profit. Therefore, we assess performance based on short-term profit, and benefits typically concentrated among owners, executives, and investors. And so that's a particular game design, right? And some companies are really good at playing that particular game, but obviously it's creating a lot of external harm in the world. And so then there's these companies that say, hey, we want to play a different game, but they don't actually create change in all of these areas. Really, what they often do is they try to add a purpose or mission or values, but they don't change the motivation system, or they're not changing what they're actually measuring as performance, or they're still keeping benefit really concentrated. And so they have a hard time actually sustaining that change, because these things actually work as a closed loop. And so I've seen a lot of big corporations over the years, and more to this day, say we're going to become a purpose-driven organization. Purpose has kind of become the new trendy buzzword. I was just at PepsiCo a few months ago, and they want all their brands to be purpose-driven. But what they're overlooking is this is not a marketing strategy, right? Which is often how they approach it, getting the tagline right and figuring out their societal role. And but
It's talking a good
actually,
game, but it's not actually
yeah,
playing the game. Yeah.
it's not playing the game. That's exactly right. That's the message I bring in, is basically, hey, you can do this, but it's a long-term effort. And there's change in all 6 of these game aspects that you need to do to actually sustain high performance at that game. So if level one is a win-lose game, level 2 is a win-win game, where you start to see a change in all 6 of these different game aspects. And so that's changing the objective from short-term profit towards accomplishing a noble mission. That's changing choice making from just command and control leadership to more empowering and empathic leadership. That's developing people not just for roles and results, but more for personal excellence and innovation. And in terms of motivation, moving from just incentives towards maximizing profit towards incentives to achieve financial, social, and environmental goals. And then, of course, measuring a triple bottom line, not just a single bottom line, and then distributing benefit to more of the value creators, with commitments to ethical minimums like fair trade and living wage. And so it's a very quick kind of like download on the 6 different game aspects that when they change, then the company can actually stay at that game. They can actually sustain the game itself. So in the face of new capital coming in, or a bunch of new employees coming in, as long as they stay focused on all 6 of these game aspects, staying at level 2, they'll actually continue to have high performance and be able to scale in that way. That's at least what I've seen. And so, I mean, we can get into all the different reasons why organizations tend to slip down. That's a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, well, and before we go there, even just thinking like Coca-Cola, for example, saying, "Yeah, I want to be purpose driven. We want to be purpose driven," and a lot of companies out there like, "Yeah, we're conscious," and yet their product in and of itself is not a conscious product. Like
Exactly. Yeah.
it's not healthy for you to drink Coca-Cola. Everybody pretty much knows that. And so what do you do with it in a situation like that, where their core product is actually the part of the problem?
You tell the truth. It's so simple. It's like
Yeah.
people aren't silly. I mean, it's like KLM Airlines did a great campaign. They were trying to figure out how to, yeah, just actually do the right thing and be more environmentally responsible. And they're like, well, if we do this whole promotion around more ecological, you know, like using disposable or recyclable cups and things like this, it just seems like a joke in the face that we're, as an airline, creating more CO2 in the environment than any other industry, And so they just told the truth, and they came out with this whole campaign and said, look, you know, like flying does actually create a major tax to the environment. And so fly less, like take the bus. Like they made an education campaign around other ways you can travel, and then talked about some of the other things they're doing. And so I think there's something really beautiful about just everybody humbly recognizing we all have a role to play. And yeah, Coke isn't going to stop selling Coke overnight, but if they actually care and they want to be trusted for caring, then they need to tell the truth.
Yeah. It's going to be an interesting journey that you have with them on that one. So, and all these companies really, because vulnerability, yeah, sure, we can hear Brene Brown talk about vulnerability, but how many companies are actually vulnerable in that way? Because there's so much, like you mentioned, about marketing and using it as a marketing strategy. I hear that a lot. It's like, I'm a purpose-driven company, or we're a conscious company. And it's like a really good buzzword to use. But then there's the practically speaking, how are we actually living that out? I mean, there's a huge difference there. And so, from the marketing standpoint, they want to look good and smell good and all that. So
Mhm.
it'll be really interesting. But shifting gears, yeah, let's talk about some of the ways that they find themselves, like you mentioned, we were going to talk about that, is like how they found themselves slipping, and how the slipping away from
Sure.
the purpose driven to becoming more profit driven, some of the ways that happens.
So one of the most common ones is the company's growing, they need to raise more capital. And it's not startup capital from friends and family who, trust them and believe in their mission. It's it's capital that often creates a restructuring of the organization and really kind of sets them into certain agreements and expectations, which in a traditional corporation is to either go public or have some sort of exit event to be able to pay back the investors. So if you're taking on equity type investment, sure, you could pay out a dividend, but that's not really what investors are going for. And so then the time comes, the company's growing, and investors are like, okay, we want to get paid back. What do you do? Like, to be in integrity to those investors, you have to sell the company. And so this is the difference between a finite game and an infinite game. So a finite game, you play to win, you play to get to a particular outcome, where the infinite game, you play for the sake of enjoyment. You play because you want to play, right? And it's purpose driven, and it's towards creating more joy for all life, right? And so that's one of the shifts in mindset that I think the world's really ready to see, is that our whole ecosystem around companies is built to support these finite games. But to actually create meaningful work environments and to actually be able to sustain purpose within organizations, we have to shift from the finite games to the infinite games. And so, yeah, how money is raised has a big part to do with that. And I'd say the second one is the founder. So the founder is like that initial seed, right? That is like within them is often the values, the vision, the mission. And then as they grow, they kind of germinate around themselves, and there more seeds grow, and they got this little team, right? And they're surviving in this garden, often is faced with drought, with a lack of capital or attack competition, and they actually have to duplicate themselves enough, and then they have a strong culture that's aligned with the vision and the values. And so it's kind of like growing a garden, right? But eventually the time comes when all these other species, all these other kind of plants come in, and some that kind of take over the garden. They take over what that original seed was actually intended to do, and the blueprint of it. Or the founder leaves. So it's not even them being overwhelmed by just more people and more agendas, but they might leave and say, this isn't my role anymore. And then next thing you know, it's just kind of profit at all costs, back to typical business. They're missing that kind of inspirational visionary leader. And we see that a lot as well.
Well, and I picture them as even at that point, the seed, but they're also the gardener. And so that gardener leaves, and, who's maintaining the garden and
Right.
keeping out the weeds and nurturing what is what is meant to be there, what was meant to be there in the first place. Great analogy. Yeah. And when you talk about, I mean, it comes from the top. It's always about leadership ultimately. But when you talk about this idea of shareholders, I just interviewed, actually I've had several people during this series that have talked about raising capital. And the last person that we just had on, just recently interviewed, she launched it's what's called Beyond Capital Fund, and it's investing in for-profit social enterprises. And so I was listening to you as you were sharing about how they fall into that selling their business and or having to be responsible to shareholders. There's like this, if you can find a pool of investors that want to invest in companies and that understand impact investing and will be able to and understand and value that those are the ones, rather than somebody coming in and purchasing it who doesn't totally get that concept, or shareholders that don't totally get that concept. And I was like, oh, there's a connection here, right? So if you can get investors that get this, that can invest in companies that get this, then perhaps you have a lot of a chance at some more sustainability.
Yeah, and there's other models. I think one of the simple things is, if you can get out of the game of equity-based investing. I mean, crowdfunding is a phenomenal example, or even I'm really excited about blockchain and these token sales. So you're kind of pre-purchasing the token that you then eventually use to use the service or product. And so that's a more complicated conversation, but nonetheless, it's basically chain rules of how we fund things. It's democratizing it. It's getting out of just equity-based investing. Revenue-based financing is another one that works for some types of companies, where it's often called a revenue loan, where basically you're paying back investors from revenue, from top-line revenue. And so there's other ways of doing it that don't trap you in traditional equity type investing.
Awesome. Well, that'll be interesting. Yeah, I wasn't even thinking about the whole crowdfunding is just a different strategy on a larger level. I mean, there's been some been some very successful crowdfunding initiatives, and if that can continue to grow, that'd be awesome. So let's talk about the movement. When we had our conversation pre-chat before this interview, we were talking about this idea, okay, how to start a movement. And you initially were like, well, there's kind of a problem with that whole idea that there's all these people out there. Everybody wants to start a movement. Everybody wants to be like, yeah, I'm that purpose-driven entrepreneur, that social enterprise like we're talking about. What is the problem with everybody not everybody yet, but a lot of people wanting to start their own little movement?
Yeah, so I think the shadow of movements, I mean, there's probably a few, but one of the ones that at least I've experienced is basically asserting your view of the world on others and leveraging good communication technology, meme creation. Um, there's a whole science called memetics, which is basically how you get ideas to spread and kind of hook the human psyche. And kind of think of like good marketing is basically based on the science of memetics. But I think it's much more useful for society to nurture people's capacity to sense into what's meaningful and act from that place rather than trying to convince them of something. And so I think a slippery slope with movements um, is the same thing that happens with cults, with ideologies, with basically a charismatic leader just is able to enroll people into a view that they're just repeating and repeating rather than actually being supported and coming to their own truth and finding their own sovereignty and their own voice. And I think that would be actually much more useful for society, is that we're nurturing that capacity in each other rather than trying to enroll people into one way.
Got it. Yeah, great distinction. So if somebody is, let's say there's somebody listening who says, I do have this idea of the world. I want to make this particular change, improve this particular area of life, improve the quality of life for everyone through this particular area, perhaps. And sometimes it is actually people that it's really more focused on the problem. I notice it's like, I don't like this, so I'm actually going to start a movement to fight this, which doesn't really work. Nature abhors a vacuum. It's not really about the fighting something, and what do you end up with then when you fight that? You don't create something else. But that being said, so if somebody is looking to start, what are some of the things that they need to consider before launching a movement, and if they actually launch a movement? So what are some of the practical things to really know that they're coming from that healthy place?
So I think the first step is to really tune in to what the source of the energy is within you. Often it's anger. Often there's a wanting to have an outlet to express rage or expect anger, but it can therefore just be repeating the same pattern, right?
Yes.
It's like the minute we point the finger, we're really just doing the same thing. We're continuing this story of separation and putting the same energy imprint into the world. And so I think the first thing is really get true to like what is the source of energy. And it's okay to have anger. It's okay to need to release that. Um, and it can be a slippery slope when you create a container called a movement. It just becomes now this release container for projecting all that anger onto something or somebody or and so I think it'd be much more effective to support those people who are angry and processing that, right? Rather than putting it on somebody else and continuing this ping pong match of us against them. So tune into the source of the energy, I think, would be step number one. um, and then step number two, I would say, is really reflect on if is there a more fundamental problem. It's like so often we rally a lot of energy around something that's really just like putting a band-aid on a more core issue, and that with a little bit more inquiry, a little bit more introspection, we can go deeper into discovering like what is actually at the root of this. And the deeper we go to that, uh, we tend to find that there's more work to do within ourselves, right? There's a journey of coming home within ourselves, and um and that's really the work. And so often we get fascinated with all the things we should change in the world and the external, and we're just kind of shuffling deck chairs around on the Titanic. And so we can we can distract a lot of people from doing meaningful work or doing meaningful healing work within themselves by creating this kind of flashy new movement that gets a bunch of energy, that has people feel like they're doing something, but they're really still just putting a band-aid on the system, right? And so So deeper inquiry, asking deeper questions, I think is a really useful thing.
I love that. And it makes me think of different movements that I've seen, and well-known ones too, that are actually, yeah, they're just fueling the anger and the fear in people. It's like anti-terrorism. Well, what's the focus on? I remember the quote from Mother Teresa that she says, if you want to invite me to an anti-war rally, I'm not going to show up. But if you
Hmm.
invite me to a peace rally, I'll be there. And there's a big difference in terms of what we focus on. And I love that, what you pointed out, and just challenging us to, if you're going to do something, what are you doing it for? And also looking at that deeper reason, so that you're not just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic, but that you're actually making substantial changes in being a true game changer, where you're actually changing the game. What I'm also wondering, or thinking about in that, is that when you get to that deeper level, there may be less people that are talking about it, that
Yeah,
issue, and yet it'll resonate differently, right? It'll resonate with people when you start speaking. When you speak truth, what's interesting, I notice, when you speak truth and wisdom, that deep insight, like one of the things that you're really good at is bringing that complexity and making it more simple and tangible, right? Is when you do that, people go, yeah, that's it. And so you can actually shift and transform the way other people see things in a good way by creating like, it's like revelation to them. Oh, wow, I hadn't looked at it that way, through this
yeah,
process. And then the very thing that you were initially thinking about, like, hey, I want to build a lot of followers, and I want to have a lot of people rallying around this, that's actually becomes more of a magnet as opposed to a strategy. Becomes a magnet because it draws people to deal with the real issue, which of course
totally.
is scary, because we also have to deal with, that's where we start off with ourselves. But yeah.
There's this great saying that um, often we're polishing the mirror only to discover the dust is on our face.
Ooh, that's good.
And
Yeah.
so often with movements, we're polishing the mirror, we're thinking we're actually making the difference, we're cleaning up the situation, when the energy we're putting out and the thing that we're doing is actually um, still the problem, when really the thing to look at is cleaning up ourselves. And
Yeah.
I think the thing that we all can be doing more is doing that deep inquiry into ourselves of like, who are we being in all of this? If we want a world that works for all life, if we want a world that has more love and peace and harmony, it's like, who are we being in that? I mean, it always starts with the self. And but it also means how we come together, right? So it's not to say we don't do movements, but it's just, I think the movement to do is is always coming together in the heart space, coming together and meeting in the truth of our unity. And and it's like a remembrance, and it's from that space that meaningful change can happen. Otherwise, we're just using the same raw materials that are the issues that we're facing, and to kind of like allow a new transformational energy to come out of us, we need to be transformed within ourselves. And that's the hard work. I mean, that's deep healing work. Um that's being willing to let go of the things that we think we're doing, that we might get some recognition for or ego gain for, that are really just not it. There's some part of ourselves that know that. And so there's often a letting go of identity, or letting go of a project or a thing that some part of you thought was so cool and so it. And um, to be willing to be humbled. Um, and that's certainly been my journey. It's like there's been so many iterations of thinking I had figured it out, only to discover the dust was on my face, right? And to just keep going deeper within and realizing that um, it's the personal transformation that starts all transformation in the world.
Yeah, there's so many people that I know, you hear like on LinkedIn, you see, thought leader in titles. all the time nowadays. I actually saw an article where somebody did a search and there was like 130,000 people on LinkedIn that had thought leader in their title. It's like, I want to be a thought leader. And it's interesting because I listened to you and you are a thought leader, but you didn't set out to be a thought leader. You just thought differently and went into that inner inquiry within yourself. And as a result of that, went, oh, and started to share that, with others. And so it's motivate. What I'm hearing the motive, like what's the motive behind it? And I think we can all be challenged with that. I was looking at leaders of transformation, being very transparent. I was looking at leaders of transformation. I was saying, okay, so like, what are we doing here? It's great. We have a podcast. We've got all these people on the show. And what are we actually doing? Like, what is the impact that we're really making? And challenging myself on that, and challenging myself on also the guests that I would have on this show. And like, what is it to, how to go deeper? And what are the main issues in the world and how do we solve those issues, and really just drilling down into that. So being in that question and saying, it's got to be more. Like, let's not stop putting the Band-Aid on it and saying we need to teach more skills, or
Yeah.
strategies and techniques and all of that. That's all good, but that comes after. That comes later, if you will, or maybe
Yeah,
never.
totally.
In some cases. But it's a much deeper, and that's where, like, I discovered, it was like, okay, what is love? Love, more love and unity. I love what you were just saying there about, this truth, like the coming home to recognizing that we're not separate, that we are all one. And I was like, love is the answer. Now, what does love in action look like? And so I was just going down that path and saying, okay, if I'm going to create something, I'm not just going to create something just because that's what everybody says is the right thing to do, but to discover that deeper issue and what's needed to solve that, and then the rest will come from there. So I'm actually in this process right now of thinking through that and saying, wow, if we could create a culture of generosity, because people are stingy, we're all being, scarcity. I need more. I need to get more clients. I hear this all the time. And what if we were to transform that? What if we were to flip that around and actually learn to be more generous? Of course, we'd have to recognize that we are enough first, right? To be able to be generous with others, we have to have it if we feel that we're empty and void, then it's going to be really hard to be generous cheerfully and
Mm-hmm.
truthfully. But it's an interesting conversation. So we'll need to
You
continue that.
said the word culture, which I think is a really important one. And it's like a fish doesn't know it's swimming in water. It's often we don't realize the culture that we're actually swimming in, and how that culture is actually reinforcing a certain behavior. I just was in India for 2.5 months, and it's beautiful. It's like it's so clear their culture is producing a different type of behavior among people. I mean, there's a deep sense of connection and joy as well. Like it's there isn't this hyper individualism or individual drive that you see in the West, and that creates this kind of like drive to be the thought leader, which when you power that with social media and the type of technology we have, you get a rampant growth in the ego, basically having a way to show how special it is to the world, and which I think is a real dysfunction in culture. And so, why don't we connect more? Why are there more and more and more people being depressed every year? We feel so disconnected from each other. Well, you have a culture that's breeding individualism combined with technology that's exacerbating it. And there's no way that culture is in a condition to actually create transformational change in the world. What it's doing is it's enabling innovation. It's enabling the capacity for somebody to drive something into existence, which perhaps is the role of the West, right? But if we're truly going to get out of this leaky canoe together, there is a coming together. There's a recognition that there is aspects of the culture we've grown up in that has created the dysfunction that we're facing. And I think the irony is, for especially a lot of progressive leaders, is it's hard to see because you're being praised for doing all this good work. You're, you're winning awards, maybe you're being elevated for like all this social change, but it's actually not the level of change that's necessary. And yeah, it takes, I think, getting out of the bubble to recognize, oh, what's the thing that we're not seeing? Because obviously it's not working, right? Here we are, 2020, climate change and social unrest and political instability, all these things continue to accelerate. And if you ask people deeply, if you think we're actually getting out of this, the answer is no. It's like there's deeper confusion, deeper concern. And so it just begs to ask the question, like, well, what's the thing that we're not seeing? Like, what's the thing that we're not seeing? And I think it's the dust that's on our face.
Well said. Well said, man. Well, we could talk for hours, and that would be super awesome. I'd love to do that, but I also respect your time and respect our listeners' time as well. And we may just have to have you back to continue this conversation. But I so appreciate your time, Andrew, and your thoughtfulness, mindfulness, and perspective on your experience, what you've seen, and also the fact, what I love is that you're still in this inquiry. One of my favorite quotes from John Wooden is, "It's what you learn after you know it all that counts." And oftentimes we get to that point where it's like, I'm an expert and I know it all. And I was there at one point where I was like, I'm supposed to know it all. I'm supposed to have all the answers. And I'm like, I clearly don't have all the answers, And so then it's like this imposter syndrome of how do I manage that persona and the reality of who I am. But what I see in you is just this beautiful humility of, I'm still in the inquiry. I'm still discovering. We're still discovering, what does this look like? Not suggesting that you have all the answers, even though you have a lot more information and research and experience in this area than many others, but that you're still standing in that inquiry. I just really appreciate.
Thank you. Well, it's a joy to be able to contribute, and yeah, blessings on the journey.
Thank you. Thank you. So for our listeners and our viewers, go to gamechangers.co. And there is actually, there's a number of companies that are listed there, and you can see their profiles and so forth and learn more about what Andrew's doing. And I would also encourage you to follow him on social. So we'll make sure the links are in the show notes on Leaders of Transformation so that you can connect with him there. Just continue in this inquiry that he's in, and learn and discover and share ideas. And this is how we grow. This is how we evolve together, and recognizing that we're all on this journey together. So, in terms of solving the challenges that we face, it would behoove us to work together to do that and come with different diverse perspectives on it, and so that we can see the whole picture more effectively. So I encourage you to follow him on social, go to his website, check it out. And we'd love to hear your stories. We'd love to hear how this has impacted you, questions that you have. If you are making an impact in the world and you want to be able to share it, you want to be able to connect with other leaders of transformation, then, reach out to us, get connected, follow us on social. And on Facebook, we have a Facebook page where we're constantly sharing what's happening in the world, positive news, great things that are happening, maybe on a national basis, it may be a local basis, it may be globally, that companies that are doing good and making a difference, or just even individuals who are doing things in their local community to make a difference. And so we love sharing those stories. And so you can follow us there and hear about that as well. And if you like this episode, please, number one, share it with others, so we can spread this message, but also leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really does help us to get a greater reach. And I oftentimes will forget to ask for our listeners to do that. But you can help us to have a greater reach, and to reach more people with a message of inspiration. And what Andrew's talking about here is to be able to bring that to people around the world. We have listeners in over 130 countries, and we want to just continue to extend that reach out. So we appreciate your support in doing that. So again, thank you for being here, Andrew. Thank you so much for being here. And we look forward to seeing you in the next episode of Leaders of Transformation real soon.